Chapter 2, Life on a Plantation. Be sure that you've asked a question about life on the plantation before you listen to this chapter. Slavery took root in the southern states because there was so much good farmland. Big plantations needed lots of workers to tend their crops, and slaves had to work for free. In the 1600s, many plantations grew tobacco. In the 1700s, the big crops in the South were rice and indigo. In the 1800s, the main crop was cotton. First, the slaves had to pluck little balls of cotton from the cotton plant. Next, they had to clean the cotton balls and get them ready for spinning. Then, the cotton was spun and turned into cloth. The richest slave owners lived on big estates and might own as many as 400 slaves. These slave owners lived like lords and ladies. They had fancy parties and dances. They went on hunts. They ate good food and wore expensive clothes. There were small plantations too. They were more like ordinary farms. The owners weren't rich and might own only a couple of slaves. But slave labor supported all the plantations, large and small. Slaves did not like their masters. Their life was mostly work, work, and more work. If they did something wrong, they were often beaten or whipped. Slave children did not go to school. In fact, slaves were forbidden to learn how to read or write. They couldn't vote or own a home. They couldn't own anything. Some slaves worked in the fields. A field slave worked from sunrise to sunset. Women worked as hard as men. Pregnant women worked in the fields right up until the birth of their babies. Then they worked with their babies strapped to their backs. Children over the age of 12 were expected to work as hard as adults. The field slaves were watched all day long by an overseer with a whip. The overseer was usually a white man. He made sure the slaves never wasted a moment. If they did, a flick of the whip made them get back to work. Field slaves usually lived in tiny huts with dirt floors. In winter, the huts were freezing cold. Instead of beds, they had only rough blankets and maybe some straw. At the end of the long day in the field, slaves on a cotton plantation had to line up. Their cotton was weighed. They were expected to pick at least 200 pounds of cotton each day. That is heavier than you are by a lot. It's heavier than I am by a lot. Field slaves had Sundays off. Sometimes they were given Saturday afternoons off too, but not during harvest time. Then they might work an 18-hour day. House slaves worked mostly indoors. They cleaned, cooked, served meals, and took care of the master's children. They waited on tables, washed, ironed, swept, dusted, hoed, and weeded gardens. House slaves also did weaving, mending, quilting, and spinning. And some slaves learned to make lace. House slaves often lived in closets or corners of the big house, even if the rest of their families lived in slave quarters. Although they did not get Sundays off, most house slaves lived better than field slaves. House slaves sometimes even managed to learn how to read or write. But field or house, inside or outside, one thing was certain. Life as a slave was a nightmare. The dream of every slave was to be free.